You're listening to True News, your alternative source for global news, analysis, and commentary. I'm Rick Wiles. The heroic efforts of Edward Snowden to expose the nefarious mass surveillance operations of the United States, Britain, and other members of the Five Eyes has awakened more Americans to the creepy realization that the world's population is being quietly encased in a high-tech electronic concentration camp. Who are the people who designed this electronic system? Where did they get the inspiration and technical know-how to conceive of such a nightmarish surveillance regime? I've talked about it on this radio program for 15 years. We are coming under the domination of the new Nazis. They learned everything from the old Nazis. Thousands of Nazis were smuggled out of Germany following the end of World War II. As I've said many times, the Allies defeated Germany. We did not defeat the Nazis. The Nazis quietly overtook us. A new book covers new ground in the historical account of Operation Paperclip, the top-secret CIA program that brought thousands of Nazis to America and South America. The book is Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America. The author is journalist Annie Jacobson. She was a contributing editor for the Los Angeles Times Magazine from 2009 to 2013. Her 2011 nonfiction bestseller, Area 51, An Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base, has been published in 5 languages and is being made into an AMC scripted television series. It's been several years since she's been on the program. Annie, welcome back to True News.
Thank you for having me.
It's hard to believe the last time you were here was 2005.
Time flies when you're writing books.
Yes, and doing radio shows.
Yes.
You know, I remember all of our guests, every single guest, and it always seems like that they were on the program like last month. And then I realized it was, almost, for you, 9 years ago. It's hard to believe. Well, listen, Operation Paperclip, this is a topic we have talked about for 15 years. So you're talking to an audience that will really want to hear what you have to say about this subject. What motivated you personally to write a book about Operation Paperclip?
That's a great question. I was actually working on the Area 51 book when I came across 2 Nazi aircraft designers named Reimar and Walter Horton. And they invented what was called the Horton 5, and it looks astonishingly like the B-2 bomber. And I learned that they were of great interest to military intelligence at the end of the war. They were overlooked for this program called Operation Paperclip, but their boss, Colonel Siegfried Kneemeyer, was not. And in learning early about Operation Paperclip at that time, I learned that Kneemeyer had been so important to the Luftwaffe, that's the German Air Force, that Hermann Göring, who was in charge of the Luftwaffe, called Kneemeyer my boy and put him in charge of all technical developments for the German Air Force. Then after the war ends, Kneemeyer comes to the United States, is part of Operation Paperclip, and when he retires in the middle 1970s, I learn that he's given the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, which is the highest award that the Pentagon can give a scientist. And I thought to myself, how does that happen? How does someone go from being this incredibly important person whose boss is Göring to this incredibly important person whose boss is the Department of Defense? And that really began my inquiry into Paperclip.
Amazing. And you would think that these guys would have been executed for the crimes that they committed against humanity.
Well, that is the question, and that is why in researching the book, I chose 21 of these scientists to focus on so that I could be very specific and show readers their individual stories, because of course we want to judge an individual person's life and their work and perhaps their nefarious criminal past by their individual actions and not as a group. And so while there were 1,600 German scientists who came to the United States, I focus on 21 of them. And that is the question, is this person guilty? You know, with Kneemeyer it was fascinating because I tracked down Siegfried Kneemeyer's grandson, And I asked if he would let me interview him, and I was astonished when he said yes. And so, I really have great faith in the courage of individuals to be transparent. As you said in your introduction, not everybody's transparent, and in this surveillance state that we are sort of moving toward, you have an incredible amount that is being concealed. But there are individuals who are willing to let the truth be known. And this grandson of Kneemeyer was one of them. He agreed to let me look at his grandfather's personal papers, including documents and letters of recommendation from Göring, from Speer. And in having access to these original documents, because I worked with a number of other family members of these high-ranking Nazis who became part of Paperclip, in having access to that kind of original documentation, I was able to then file Freedom of Information Act requests from the Department of Defense to get more information, look at these lost or classified dossiers, and piece together this story that is very complicated and really, at times, quite nefarious.
Are the children and grandchildren of these Nazi scientists in the United States today, or are they living abroad?
A number of them are in the United States. A number of them are in Germany. I travel to both places, so it's interesting when you see that many of the Paperclip scientists that came to the United States, in fact, the great majority of them, were given visas, then were given citizenship. Their entire families came here. And in many ways, some of these people who I really point out should have been held accountable for crimes were actually kind of given state-sponsored witness protection, so to speak, and a job, and in some cases, awards. And then others were such hot potatoes. That was actually the term that the military used for these guys who were so close to Hitler and his inner circle that we couldn't bring them to the United States, so we set them up in these secret military facilities that we were running in Germany. And that is why some of the children of Operation Paperclip scientists live in Germany, because they actually never came to the United States.
I think it was John Loftus who put the number of Nazis that were brought out under Operation Paperclip. I think he said it was around 10,000. You're focusing just on scientists, 1,600 scientists. I think Mr. Loftus estimates it was a total of about 10,000 Nazis who were brought out.
I would not be surprised at all, because that number, that 1,600 number, is from the declassified files at the National Archives. And so clearly there are more. And also the CIA's involvement in the Nazi repatriation program, let's call it, that is its own can of worms. I write about the CIA in places where they overlapped with military intelligence to use the same scientists. And actually there's great drama in the book about, at first the CIA is sort of cooperating with military intelligence and saying, I found this one incredible memo that said, could you send us that list? It's a very sort of innocuous statement. And the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they're running the Operation Paperclip. This is right after the CIA is created in 1947. And they send over this important list called the Osenberg list, which has all of the scientists, all 15,000 of Hitler's top scientists during the war. So the CIA gets a hold of this list, and then you find later, I found in documents, the CIA kind of saying, we're going to start running our own program because now we have the list.
The predecessor to the CIA was the OSS, and its first director, Wild Bill Donovan, who then later became the first director of the CIA, he ordered the assassination of General Patton. And Patton was murdered by the OSS. I interviewed the author who actually interviewed the assassin on his deathbed. Now, the assassin did not succeed in killing General Patton. He hit him with a projectile, but old Blood and Guts didn't die, so they killed him later in his hospital bed, in the Army hospital bed. But I've often wondered, Annie, what did General Patton know at the end of World War II? Why was he so furious? And he was planning to go back to the United States and spill his guts about something. And I have a feeling it was Operation Paperclip.
Well, I'm not familiar with that aspect of the story. I actually didn't even know that. I don't know the assassination story, or attempt, rather, of Patton. So I'm not qualified
I was
on
wondering if you had come across the general's name in any of this.
But what is interesting about the OSS is that Donovan had an office at Camp King, it was called, and it's a facility I found it to be the first post-war black site that used enhanced interrogation techniques. And that was a joint operation by the CIA, Army, Navy, and Air Force intelligence. Camp King was a facility outside Frankfurt in occupied Germany after the war. But immediately after the war, and I'm talking about May of 1945, Donovan had an office there, and I interviewed one of his interrogators who learned interrogation techniques from Donovan. And Donovan's job was to work with these high-ranking Nazis. They called them Nazi Bonzen, and they were transferred from the Ashcan facility in Luxembourg where they were held before they were taken to Nuremberg to be tried. And many of them wrote monographs, sort of like very academic papers for the U.S. Army and for the OSS about the military order of battle.
Annie, I grew up in Western Maryland, so I was very close to Catoctin, the underground Pentagon. Not too far away was Fort Detrick. And where I lived in the surrounding area of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, there were a lot of underground facilities. I understand that the U.S. military gained knowledge from the Nazis about how to build these vast underground fortified bunkers. Did you come across any of that information?
That is a major thread of the narrative of Paperclip, and the way that I tell that story is through one of the most important players, George Rickey. And he was in charge of the Nordhausen underground slave labor tunnel, which is where the V-2 rockets were built. So Rickey was working with von Braun, with General Dornberger, with Arthur Rudolph. These are all big names in the space, in the U.S. space program, but they all were working together in this very dark-hearted Nordhausen tunnel complex. And when Rickey was captured by the Allies, he was captured by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Service, and they were very interested in finding out why Nordhausen was able to withstand the bombs, the bombing campaigns, because we obviously wanted to have that technology for ourselves. And Rickey shared with them that he had actually been the engineer in charge of building the Führer bunker under Berlin. And these are incredible documents to read. The original transcripts of these conversations, of course, Rickey is speaking in German and they're being translated, but nonetheless, he's boasting about how he was in charge of building the Führer bunker. And so you can kind of see, reading between the lines and looking at these documents, the excitement on the part of the U.S. Army saying, we need this guy, and then making arrangements to bring him first to London, where he worked with Allies, and then over to Wright-Patterson in Ohio. It was actually called Wright Field at the time. And there he began his work on these underground, how those complexes were engineered. Those would later go on and become, you're referring to Site R in the mountains there near where you grew up, which was called Raven Rock.
Yeah,
and I actually interviewed
precisely where it's at. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the camp doctor who was in charge. He was the physician that would have been, in the event that World War III had happened, he would have been the physician in the bunker with Eisenhower. But this is really a twisted part of the story, because in the middle of Rickey's work, this is in 1946, the story surfaces that Rickey was actually the man who engineered some of these hangings inside the Nordhausen tunnel complex when some of the prisoners revolted. And so Rickey actually gets pulled out of the program, gets sent back to Germany and stands trial at Dachau, where they had a war crimes trial. I went to look at that trial room. It was an old SS facility that we transformed into a trial facility, very much the way now we have Saddam's palaces, or rather during the Iraq War, we sort of took over Saddam's palaces and made them our own. This was sort of had its origins after World War II for the U.S. Army. And the crazy thing about the Rick A. trial is that he was acquitted, and later on in life he would be called to be a witness in different war crimes trials, and he would always maintain the same line, which is that he had no idea any of this was going on.
I never thought about this until now, but I wonder if Camp David is connected to Site R, and that when a U.S. president flies in a helicopter over to Camp David in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland, and he goes into what looks to be, a log house, a resort, kind of a rustic resort. Does he simply descend in an elevator and go into Site R, into a vast underground city? I've never thought about that until now.
I do know a bit about that from having interviewed individuals who worked there. And Camp David is definitely connected to Site R in terms of proximity, and that was the idea about building, about the way that the two worked. But they're a bit further apart than that. And my understanding, and again, this is from the post-physician who worked there in the 50s, Dr. Len Kreisler. He discusses what that place was like, but they keep most people on the periphery. In other words, you would work at Camp Ritchie, which is several miles from the entrance to Site R, and so that place is so secret in terms of its layout and its plans that it would be speculation to know really what goes on there.
I will tell you, this is a true story, and I can tell the story because this man is deceased, and he can't get in trouble for me telling the story. I'm not going to give his name, but he's deceased, and so I can go ahead and tell the story. He was just a general contractor in Maryland, where I grew up, and he told me one time that he had a contract at Fort Ritchie, and just to do some construction work. Anyhow, he opened up the wrong door. He went in, it was like a barracks, and he said it was full of hospital beds, hundreds of beds, and soldiers were strapped down, and they were absolutely going berserk. He said everybody. He said it was like a madhouse. He said, I don't know what they had done to those men, but he said it was the most bizarre sight he'd ever seen. And one other time, I think he was, this was also at Fort Ritchie, he went into an underground room where he was not supposed to be. They told him, this is where you work, do not go any further. When nobody was around, he opened up another door, and it was a laboratory full of cages with hideous-looking animals that they were doing experiments on. So that was Fort Ritchie, and I grew up in that area. We were told Fort Ritchie this is just just Army Communications Center. So obviously they were doing a lot more there at Fort Ritchie than sending military communications. Annie, I'm old enough to remember, when I was in elementary school, we watched Alan Shepard's launch, John Glenn's launch on TV in school in the 60s, and I still remember. I can see her face. One of my elementary school teachers standing in front of the classroom with this big glow on her face, and she said, "Class, today I'm going to tell you about a true American hero, Wernher von Braun." I still remember that. And back then I think, oh, Wernher von Braun. So we were all excited as kids. Oh, Wernher von Braun, he designed these rockets and all this. Well, it turns out he's a Nazi.
Yes, it's one of the really complicated parts about the story, because remember that your teacher was getting information that was being given to her by many, many people. And the idea and the truthfulness that von Braun was a member of the SS and that he absolutely knew what was going on in the Nordhausen tunnels. And as Michael Newfield revealed in his biography of von Braun just recently, von Braun would actually go to the Buchenwald concentration camp and hand-pick the slave laborers. Now, that information was completely repressed by the U.S. Army and then later NASA. They propagated this idea that von Braun was just a good German scientist. All he wanted to do was get to the moon. And they needed that fiction to be truth. And they helped von Braun propagate that fiction, which is so unfortunate. And one of the memos that I found, which really underscores that, is von Braun had to give testimony at one of these war crimes trials in the 60s, one of those follow-up trials that actually George Rickey, the engineer we were just discussing, was involved in. And the Germans wanted him to be able to come and to speak to the jury. But the NASA said, no way are we letting him go there. And so instead they allowed him to give testimony. They chose the most obscure place they could think of, a courthouse in Louisiana. But still, the press got wind of this, and they were waiting there on the courthouse steps when von Braun came out from giving his testimony, and they said, is it true? Did you know about these war crimes? And his answer was, carefully coached in advance by NASA, I have been fully investigated by the U.S. military. They know entirely about my past. I'm paraphrasing what von Braun said, but you get the idea that they told him to say that, but of course the big elephant in the room being left out was that they knew what his past was. He knew what his past was. It was a tacit agreement to never speak of such things.
Unbelievable. What about the Dulles brothers? Where do they figure in all this?
Well, Alan Dulles was a very, very complicated figure in terms of Paperclip. He authorized these enhanced interrogation techniques, I found, early in the 50s, much earlier than has later, reported as happening later. I'm talking about the MK Ultra experiments, those notorious CIA program, where people were drugged to try and get them to reveal secrets. But the MK Ultra program, I found, was running parallel to Paperclip at that black site we talked about earlier, Camp King, outside Frankfurt in Germany, and they had earlier operational code names. They were called Operation Bluebird and Operation Artichoke. And there at Camp King, Dulles ordered these enhanced interrogation techniques using LSD on Soviet bloc prisoners who were being kept at that facility. And this program was a combination with Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, Air Force intelligence. But the real mystery of all of this is that the camp physician, so the doctor in charge of everyone's well-being at Camp King, this is both the military, the American military officers, and the civilian CIA agents who work there, as well as those Soviet bloc prisoners who are being interrogated. The physician in charge of their well-being was the former Surgeon General of the Third Reich, Dr. Walter Schreiber. He was part of Paperclip. And when Schreiber was finally given the okay by the Joint Chiefs to go to Texas to work at the Air Force there, Dr. Kurt Blome, who was in charge of Hitler's bacteriological warfare program, Blome became the chief physician at Camp King. I write about both of these characters in the book, and their stories are really unbelievable.
Annie, you're bringing information now that I've not heard in 15 years, and I've interviewed a lot of people on this subject. You've really done your homework on this.
Well, Blome was a fascinating individual to research. He was so high up in the Reich medical chain of command. He also wore the Golden Party badge, which means he had favor by the Fuhrer. And Blome was Deputy Surgeon General for the Third Reich, and his family members were some of the ones that were incredibly courageous and transparent with me, and gave me information that had never been revealed. Had never done an interview with a journalist before, but shared with me some documentation. I can only imagine how difficult that is as a child of someone like that. But to, again, let that story, the truthfulness of the story, come forward.
Does your book touch on the story of Dr. Frank Olson, the Fort Detrick microbiologist?
Well, Dr. Frank Olson, I learned, came to Camp King, and it was at Camp King that Olson participated in those enhanced interrogation experiments. And this, according to his colleague Norman Kornjaer, who was actually interviewed by some German colleagues of mine who were working on the Olson story. Kornjaer worked at Fort Detrick with Olson and shared with the German documentarians that Olson was deeply disturbed by what he saw at Camp King and what he participated in, and that led to his precarious position with the CIA. And I do tell the story of his downfall and that great tragedy.
So they killed him with LSD. They killed him with LSD. He jumped out the window on LSD given to him by the CIA because they knew he was extremely distraught over what he saw at Camp King.
Well, I certainly don't know what they thought, but what I can tell you is that the facts lie out that Frank Olson was actually at Camp King participating in these very nefarious experiments on behalf of the CIA. And then later, without his knowledge or consent, his own organization, the CIA, drugged him with LSD, which led to his having a breakdown and either jumping or being pushed out that window and killing him.
A lot of bankers doing it lately.
You know, it's a really twisted idea when you get involved into this hall of mirrors, you know, when you have that idea of making deals with the devil, the complex morality that comes with having to decide as a person what is right and what is wrong, but having an allegiance to an organization that is telling you a different story.
Well, you really said it right there, making a deal with the devil, because that's really what this is all about. This is entirely evil. There's no other word that can describe what is taking place. Is there a Nazi connection to Fort Detrick, Maryland?
Well, Fort Detrick was the place where the CIA set up the special operations, and that was the division that was working on what we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. And also, Fort Detrick was working in concert with Edgewood Arsenal, and you had the chemical weapons program and the biological weapons program working hand in glove, and the Army Chemical Corps was in charge of both programs. I profile at length one of the top generals in that program, a gentleman named Brigadier General Lukes, and he was in charge of working with Hitler's chemists. I found some astonishing papers at an archive at the U.S. Military History Institute archive in Pennsylvania. Lukes' personal desk diaries that he kept revealed a whole side of Paperclip that has never before been written about or known, but I'm going to leave it to the reader to have to read about that.
Annie, is there one particular American name that pops up consistently in your story who was the key player, mastermind in Operation Paperclip?
Well, there's a couple central organizing players, and I write about them, but because each military service was interested in its own programs, you had kind of an umbrella concept going on with Paperclip. I mean, the people in Army Ordnance were incredibly interested in the V-2 rocket. The biological weapons makers were targeting the scientists who were working for the Reich in that manner. And, of course, the Chemical Corps was after all of Hitler's chemists. So I focus on those three weapons systems, probably more so than any other, just because they're so significant and important today. You know, I'll end on this note. One of the most really dark-hearted programs was the sarin gas program. And, of course, that has a link to today because we're looking at Syria and Assad's chemical weapons being dismantled, allegedly, and that's sarin gas. And one of the members of Operation Paperclip was Dr. Otto Ambros, who the A in sarin gas denotes his name. Ambros was actually convicted at Nuremberg of mass murder and slavery. He was Hitler's favorite chemist. He invented synthetic rubber. He was convicted, he was in prison, and he was given clemency by U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, John McCloy. And his finances were restored, and later he would get a contract with the U.S. Department of Energy.
Annie, one last question. Does all of this knowledge that you've gained through this investigation disturb you about things that are taking place in the United States of America right now, namely mass surveillance, electronic police state? Are you connecting the dots?
Well, I think it would be impossible not to connect those dots because you're looking at a larger subject, which is the military-industrial complex. I mean, the military-industrial complex, I learned, really began much earlier than President Eisenhower acknowledged on his exit speech. I mean,
but he did warn about it. He did warn. He knew something very evil was taking place.
He warned about it, and actually the second part of his warning discusses scientists and speaks, I write about this in the book, he talks about how we should be very careful to give scientists too much power. Herb York, one of the Defense Department's top scientists, went to Eisenhower after he retired and asked him point blank, "To whom were you referring?" Eisenhower said Edward Teller, inventor of the hydrogen bomb, and Werner von Braun. So there was this idea that scientists and science could become too important to the military-industrial complex and could get out of the hands of the government. And I believe that that is what he was speaking to, and I think that that, more than anything, is what a reader can really learn and be fascinated by in this book, because it does connect the dots today. It allows you to make informed decisions about what you think is going on based on a long history that supports certain facts.
Annie, I've got a lot more questions, but I know you got to go. Can we get you to come back in the near future to talk about Area 51?
It would be a pleasure.
Okay. That's a deal. All right, Annie Jacobson, her newest book is Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America. Thank you, Annie. Appreciate you being here on True News.
Thanks for having me.